The following podcast episode is intended for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The views expressed in this episode are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any specific organization or institution. The discussion on zero bail policy is based on publicly available information and general understanding of the topic. Listeners are encouraged to conduct their own research and consult with legal professionals for personalized advice regarding any legal matters discussed in this episode. Furthermore, the information provided in this episode may not be comprehensive or up to date as laws and policies regarding the zero bail policy are subject to change. Listeners should be also aware that individual experiences and perspectives may vary, and the content of this episode should not be relied upon as the sole source of information on the zero bail policy. By listening to this podcast episode, you acknowledge and agree that the host, guest, and producers are not liable for any actions taken or decisions made based on the information provided in this episode. All right, here we go. Here we go. Another episode of Diverse Talking Heads podcast. I'm your host, Calvin Gibbs, and tonight we have a very special show in that our usual panelists will be moderators with me tonight. And I want to introduce them right away, and then we will talk to our guest for this evening. Please welcome moderator Charlie.
Calvin, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, Charlie. Moderator Dan.
Good evening. Good to see everyone and looking forward to our discussion.
Yes, indeed. And we have moderator Kaushal. Good evening, Kaushal.
Good evening back to you.
Thank you, sir. We have moderator Marcette. Marcette, good evening.
Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight?
So far, so good. We're doing fine. And we have moderator Amy. Amy, good evening.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So good to be here.
And we have moderator Karen. Karen, good evening.
Hey, everybody. How's everyone doing?
We are good, Karen. Glad you could join us this evening. And we have as I said, we have a guest this evening. He is an attorney from the state of Texas. Ken W. Good graduated from Hardin Simmons University in 1982 with a Bachelor's of Arts degree. He's got a Master of Education from Tarleton State University, which is part of the Texas A&M system. In 1989, he received his law degree from Texas Tech School of Law, where he was a member of the Texas Tech Law Review. Mr. Good has argued cases before the Supreme Court of Texas and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, along with other courts of appeals, including the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Council. He's married and has two daughters. Please welcome Attorney Ken W. Good to the show. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a little intimidated at the moment. Y'all are a very intimidating crowd, but it's probably the biggest group I've spoken in front of on a podcast. So I kind of like, oh my gosh. But hey, I look forward to it. Yeah. As I said before we started, I'm catching up with all of y'all because I have a birthday in 2 days. So I'm going to hit 63.
Wow, wow. Well, let's get that out of the way right now and say happy birthday. Happy birthday to you.
Happy
Thank you.
Happy
birthday.
birthday.
Happy
birthday.
birthday.
Y'all are very kind.
All right. Well, let's get to it. Oh, and by the way, be comfortable. We don't bite unless, we have to. We're, but when we talk about diverse talking heads, yes, we all are diverse from different backgrounds, different nationalities, of course, and we have different points of views on at times, and we're not afraid to speak our minds. So let's get started with this topic of bail reform in the US. It's an ongoing debate over zero bail policies. And the increase of crime across this country has become a hot topic of national significance. So, how did we get here? How did we get here? We know that for years, with the cash bail system, a lot of people that could not afford it, a lot of people that came from impoverished areas, poor backgrounds, could not afford to get themselves out of jail. And sometimes it would be for crimes that did not need to have them in prison for an extended period of time, yet they were there, could not get out. The tendency over the last few years has been some states, Illinois was the first to start changing that. So this evening, we will ask questions of our guest and see what we can find out. Any moderators want to go first? Dan.
Ken, good to have you with us. As Calvin mentioned, about a year ago, here in Illinois, they went with the cash bail system has been eliminated. My question is, I'm curious if you've had a chance to take a look at it, and what are some of the lessons now that it's been implemented in real time? What are some of the lessons that some other states can learn from it?
Well, good question. I think I've actually written an article on this issue, but you're talking about the Safety Act, and the what Illinois has done in the last year has been a little bit confusing because it's been misrepresented in the press, because they represent that Illinois is the first state to get rid of cash bail, but Illinois got rid of surety bondsmen years ago, and the argument they made is, well, we're just going to get rid of the middleman. Well, that assumes bondsmen don't do anything but just get you out of jail, which we now know since that time that they got rid of surety bonds, crime has started increasing. And so what they kind of were using was cash bonds. That's so they're actually technically correct, but it's just being misrepresented. So you can either pay a cash bond to get out of jail, or could, before the Safety Act, pay a cash bond or a percentage of the cash amount to get out of jail. The problem is the courts were, using the failures to appear to pay for some of their operations. And, so Illinois, with nothing to replace it with, but just simple release, which is, I believe, a significant cause of increasing crime, passed the Safety Act. The courts, we were expecting the courts to hold it unconstitutional. I predicted they were not, because it's a political issue. The courts were going to say, don't involve us in a political issue. If you regret passing it, just go back and do what you should have done in the first place. I think that Illinois is in a much worse place than it was even a year ago, because now the courts don't have the money for operations. They have no accountability. People don't come to court. Crime is even getting worse than it was before, which is already increasing. And they're not even trying to, they weren't trying to make you safer. If you look at the Safety Act was really to address criminals, to make it easier harder for them to be held. And I understand. Let me just say this. Let's assume that some people in proposing these proposals had good intent. So, like Calvin said, we want to protect the poor. The problem is when you tie the hands of the judges so that they can't address certain crimes for poor people, they cannot, at the same time, they can't address them for gangs, career criminals, organized crime, or right now, the probably a really bad one is victims of domestic violence, because you're doing a crime-based release. Whatever, you've decided this crime, you're just going to release people. And so you're not going to hold them. And so that's a recipe for disaster wherever it's been tried in the country. I did a podcast with the DA and with a DA from California. He said misdemeanor courts in California across the state have an 80% failure to appear rate under a simple release system. That means their cases are put on hold till they come back. If they don't come back, they can't make them come back. So their cases end up having to be dismissed. So you have a voluntary criminal justice system for misdemeanors. So my criticism is then why do we have misdemeanor courts? Calvin, I will come straight to you, but I just want to say Harris County is doing a similar thing in Texas. That's Houston, having an 80% failure to appear rate. That's what's happening, where they do these simple release mechanisms. You create chaos, you no longer can have accountability, and that creates de facto decriminalization. Calvin, I'm sorry. It's your show. You take over.
Oh, no. My question is, so if they fail to appear in court, can't they be arrested?
Okay, so
Shouldn't they be arrested for not appearing?
Well, let me tell you what the stories are in Houston. So we've got examples of people who've been arrested 5, 10, 15 times. Since it's a charge-based release, every time you fail to appear and you get arrested, you turn around and get the same simple release. It's a release on a promise that you'll come back. That's the reason why we have problems with that. It gets rid of accountability. And remember, your jails will be full. Like Harris County's jail right now is full of very dangerous people because they haven't been trying cases for a year. So they don't have room in the jail to hold anybody accountable. They don't have room in the jail to do anything about misdemeanors. And so we have examples where people didn't show up 17 times, and as a result, they get 17 more bonds. So what are the misdemeanor courts doing in Harris County? They've quit requiring misdemeanor defendants to show up for court.
But they have room in the courts to hold people for misdemeanors that can't pay the bail.
No, I don't agree with that. They're not anybody under these simple release mechanisms that where misdemeanors are being held in court. We don't have room across the country after the pandemic to hold misdemeanors. I have always argued that's a talking point. That's not a reality. You can always find an example, but that's not what's going on. In Texas, I promise you, there's nobody that's being held because they can't afford a $100 bond. If your bond is set at $1,000 and you go to a surety bondsman, he's going to charge you $100. If you can't afford to pay $100, he's going to take a payment plan, and he may post that bond for as little as $10. In fact, the bonding community is being criticized for not requiring the money all up front to make it more difficult for people to get out of jail. So the bail industry gets criticized going and coming for either not working enough with defendants or working too much with defendants. So they get criticized both ways.
Okay, and I'm sorry for jumping in like that. Dan, did you have a follow-up to that?
No, that was you answered it. Thank you.
Okay, any other moderator? Karen, and then Kosho.
I have a question, Ken. So if these people are continuously released, what does it take for them to be held and tried? Does it take something like hitting the media, something really dramatic and traumatic, even though, with the no cash bond system? How do you stop that person from continuous criminal activity? Because they can't go on forever.
Karen, it's very nice to meet you. I know you were running late, and so I wanted to start out by saying hi. I love your hat. I don't know if that's what you call it, but I love that. That's one of the problems. People come to me and say, "What's the compromise?" And the problem is, it's hard to compromise when people with the other side, when we won't even agree on facts. I was always taught in law school that you can argue about what to apply to the facts, but the facts are the facts. We all have to agree on facts, and I don't think that the discussion that goes on right now, the other side is willing to agree as to a simple fact that crime is going up. And when you do a charge-based release system, so
Mhm.
if you're charged with auto theft and we've decided that you're going to be released for that, that's just a crime that we're not going to require bail. We're going to give you a personal bond in Texas. Then that's the problem. Gangs, organized crime, and career criminals figure out how to make millions and millions of dollars by doing that one crime over and over and over again. And that's why I'm saying when we set up policies, even if they're good intended to tie the hands of judges to protect the poor, we're tying the judges of their hands also to address real crime. And these criminal elements are figuring out right away where to do it. And I didn't realize it until just recently that the segment of the community that we really are turning our back on, and we don't even realize it, is domestic violence victims or survivors, because those in Texas, that starts out as a misdemeanor. And so under this charge-based release system in Texas, like in Harris County, Houston, where they're doing that right now under a guise of a court order that has been reversed, but they're still doing it. Someone was arrested. It was not, so he was on bond when he got arrested for hitting his wife. And so he was on a personal bond when he got arrested again, and they just released him right away again, and he went home and killed his wife. And he stabbed her over 30 times in her stomach. And he did it because she was pregnant. And he said, I don't want any other man to raise my child. And, there was a bill filed in Texas called Caitlin's Law in response to that. And while that bill didn't pass, it was incorporated into the ultimate bill that passed. And what it did was limit the use of simple release mechanisms for certain crimes. And so that's kind of the way we're addressing it. But if the judge wants to release you on $1, they still can. And we've had some situations where, right now it's so bad in Houston that I even, used to, if you were charged with capital murder, you didn't get out of jail because that's one of the crimes that the Texas Constitution says you can be held on. But because of the politics, they started releasing capital murder defendants, and they would commit capital murder again. And so I started, when I was speaking at groups, I would say, in Houston right now, you're like a dog. You get one free bite. You get one free murder before they're going to hold you in jail. And we're starting to see that change, and it needs to change more because we're just seeing politics run amok right now there in Houston, and it's running policy in Texas statewide in the opposite direction.
Okay, thank you. Karen, did you have a follow-up to that?
No, thank you.
Well, I do. And my follow-up is, it seems that the initial problem with that scenario that you just talked about in domestic violence is that they let him go to start with. You beat up on your wife, a spouse, or another person. I think that should be grounds to hold you there for a while.
It is. And, in Texas, we amended our constitution to allow that, but it's still just a misdemeanor. And so, we have reformers that are pushing that you can never hold someone accused of a misdemeanor ever. You have to release them. Even though we've amended the constitution to allow it for domestic violence victims, our survivors, for people accused of doing those heinous crimes to them, you can. People are not doing it. But let's compare. We don't have the capacity, no state does, to be a release or detain state. That's what the federal government does. And when they changed the law to become that in the mid 80s, they went from holding 25% of people arrested and holding them till trial to now currently they hold almost 75% of the people arrested, they hold them till trial. Texas, I'm sure Illinois can't either. We can't, or Maryland or Florida or New Jersey, we cannot hold 75% of the people arrested in jail until trial. And so that's why we have these different release mechanisms. The private surety bail system is the one that has been around the longest. It has the best success rate by far. It's not even close. And so when you allow somebody to be released on one the private surety bail system, there's going to be a period of time where they have to get family involved. They have to agree to pay a certain sum of money. So that causes a cooling off period. But also when they get out, if family's involved, they're saying, calm down. And so they're having this period where they're coming to their senses because they've got family standing up with them. I mean, we're we're forgetting the value of family standing up for people who are wayward children. And we're losing those opportunities. And so I think that we can't be a detain or release state or country. We just don't have the capacity. The problem we're having right now is nobody is willing to build additional jails. So we have to deal with the capacity we have. That would make it worse. And so the people arguing that we switch to that, they are arguing that because they know that creates chaos. We don't have room to do that. And so that's a strategy on their part just to make it even worse.
So let me see if I can recap this and whether I have it straight. So what is the degree of the amount of hurt that I would have to put on my spouse before that's not considered a misdemeanor anymore?
Well, obviously, when you kill her, that is I mean, that's capital murder.
Wait a
or
minute.
murder.
If we go straight to
them,
death?
it's assault.
There's nothing in between there?
Okay, but we already have a problem with domestic violence victims in our criminal justice system because our current procedure across the country is if you are assaulted, you go to the government and they get you
Yep.
a protective order. How
Right.
much protection does that give you? The problem that we have now with these simple release mechanisms where they're not even being held, you've got a protective order. Okay, great. They're being arrested. They're immediately being released. You can't even think about going to the police. You have to immediately run and hide. And that's a big difference in our criminal justice system. Domestic violence survivors are having to run and hide. They can't even think about going to the police right now because of these bad bail reform moves that are being taken, especially in our urban areas.
Wow. Thank you for that. Caution.
Ken, I'm aware of charities that pay the bail on behalf of defendants who can't afford to do so. Do you have an opinion on these charities?
I actually do. And I am against them for a limited way. So, we've always had charitable bail funds. New York has one of the oldest ones. The problem is they've never had very much money, so they've never really been very involved very much in the criminal justice system. That all changed when we had the George Floyd situation. We had politicians recommending people that they contribute to charitable bail funds because what they were saying is we're going to have a whole bunch of people arrested and they're going to need to be bonded out. Well, the problem is the people that were arrested never had charges filed. They were released without bail. So that bail was never needed or ever used. And as a result, we have charitable bail funds across the country that have large sums of money and they're looking to bail people out. The problem that we've had is they have found what I have argued is that there's not any misdemeanor people languishing in jail. And so they've ended up getting in trouble because they're bonding out people who should not be bonded out. So if you are a defendant and you go through and you become a career criminal, when you first get arrested, you're not even held, but when you're arrested again and again, first your friends start falling away and your family still stays with you, but you can get arrested so many times that even your family falls away from you. And those are the people that are career criminals that need to stay in jail. And where these funds have gotten in trouble is those are the people that they have been bonding out. We've had situations like Texas passed a bill. It didn't limit who they could bond out, but it required certain transparency. Since then, other states have limited charitable bail funds to only posting bonds for misdemeanors and $2,000 misdemeanors. Georgia has a bill pending right now to bar charitable bail funds from being used in that state. I think that goes a little bit too far because a charitable bail fund, all it is doing is posting cash bonds, a cash bond. If the family has cash, they can post the bond and they'll get out of jail. Cash bond is something that's recognized in Texas. So all a charitable bail fund is doing is posting cash for somebody. And they're saying they're a nonprofit and they're designating who can do it for them. And we don't limit that. We just require transparency on who they're bonding out. But I think other states are coming to a conclusion that we need to limit them more. And I wouldn't be surprised if Texas revisits that.
Okay, thank you for that. Uh, Cultural, did you have a follow-up for that question?
No, I didn't. I appreciate the eye-opening answer.
Okay, and next up
Well,
is Amy.
before you go to Amy, let me just say I have done a podcast on this very issue, charitable bail funds, and so we do have an episode talking about charitable bail funds on our podcast, on my podcast, the bailpost.com.
Okay, thank you, Amy.
Yes, thank you for asking for follow-up because mine is a tangent. So thank you. This is so lively. My dad he's retired, a criminal defense attorney, and I just feel so invigorated because one of his favorite things to do with me was to talk. I will say spar. I think I'm very I didn't have the stuff to go on and become an attorney, but it is still, I'm like, oh, I remember these type of conversations. So it's kind of, I hope that's not too perverse to say it's invigorating. He would simplify it for me. And whenever we talked about something like retribution or punishment or trying to make things even or anything like that, his comeback, which I was never able to break, was, will it prevent future crime? Like, does the death penalty prevent future crime? Discuss. Not that I'm taking the podcast in that direction, but that was that sort of conversation.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
I can wrap my head around, does bail prevent future crime? Does somebody not steal something because, oh my gosh, I might have to make bail, although in some states you don't have to? And then does it prejudice against, like you said, syndicate crime or richer, organized crime, or people that just have resources who, I'm going to steal 10 cars before I run out of money, versus somebody who doesn't have that? So I would be very interested to hear, because I don't know that bail stops crime overall, right? I think it might delay it, but I would like to hear, if you had a perfect solution, what would that be? Or where would you like to see us go that would do more to kind of just solve the crime issue, as opposed to kind of where we are now, which I think doesn't address like the full
Well,
issue.
let me start with addressing your question about does private surety bail prevent crime? There's a study from California, from Yolo County, that was released after COVID. And what he did, since during COVID, they went to a zero bail policy. He compared the release of nonviolent offenders, misdemeanor offenders on zero bail versus ones that were released on a surety bond. And he found that for those released on zero bail, they had a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense over the next 18 months. How is that possible? Because criminals find out very quickly that there's no accountability when there's zero bail, because nobody's coming to court. Like in Harris County, when you have a 40%, 50%, or 2 years of an 80% failure to appear rate, that starts compounding weekly. If you have 1,000 people to show up, then that's 800 the first week that didn't show up. If you bump them to the second week, we've got 1,800. So, and I'm not a math major, so I don't know what 80% of 1,800 is, but it just compounds every week and gets worse and worse. That's why I say it creates chaos. And so it absolutely does. Criminals see that as a green light to commit more crime. We've seen that time and time again. We have a case that shows that clearly. It's called Samuel versus Alabama, where a county in Alabama had to live under one of these simple release mechanisms, preliminary injunction, for 4 years while the case went up on appeal. And during that time, crime started increasing. Nobody would show up for court, but they ultimately won. And I had the sheriff on my podcast, and I talked to him, well, what happened after you won? He said, we were able to re-implement a system of accountability. And if you didn't show up for court, there were consequences. And within 6 months, crime started going down. And then your last part of your question, and I want to answer it directly, is what would be the perfect system to get people to come to court and to start getting crime to go down? I would start with, I'm going to quote a mayor from North Carolina who was on News Nation on a town hall talking about rising crime. And she said, and she said, until you have an alternative to the private surety bail system that has the same high level of appearance, so they have a low failure to appear rate and a high level of accountability, till you have something that's similar to that or close to that, then you don't have an alternative. And I think that's absolutely correct. And when you have, the private surety bail system has a less than 10% failure to appear rate, and then you've got these simple release mechanisms that have 80%, but let's even soften it, say 40%. The MacArthur Institute or Vera Institute said that any change would have a 40% failure to appear rate, and that should be okay. No, 40% failure to appear rate cripples our criminal justice system and causes a collapse because we have overworked courts. If you don't show up, your case gets put on hold until you come back. And then when you come back, it's usually because you have committed another crime. So we have to have, I mean, honestly, this sounds very, I mean, some people could call me not being serious, but we need to be using the private industry more to ensure people come to court. And if they don't, we have to overlay accountability to that. If they don't have a good reason for why they didn't show up for court, they should, if you gave them a personal bond, they shouldn't get another one. If they got a simple release mechanism and they showed that they could not be successful in that, then you don't give them another one. And there's a point in time, if they can't come to court, then you need to hold them until their case is resolved because the courts can't function if they aren't in court. We have to put their case on hold. That's what we're missing right now. We're missing any accountability where these things are being tried. Look in California, we did a referendum to change certain felony crimes to misdemeanors because we were going to help them get jobs. They were going to still have to answer for their misdemeanors. And one of those was theft under $950. And then in our urban areas, our DA said, I'm no longer going to prosecute theft under $950. So it went from a felony to no crime. And now you have shops closing in California because they can't withstand $25,000 a day in shoplifting. You've got the Nancy Pelosi Federal Building in San Francisco telling their employees to work from home because it's not even safe to come to work. You've got commercial buildings in San Francisco selling for 30%, 50% of their value from a year or a year and a half ago. And somebody said this, I think it may have been Karen, who said, what we're doing is not sustainable. And I agree with that. That's why I have hope. I have big hope that the ship will be righted because it is not sustainable. People will not stand for being, taken for all this crime. We will resort to vigilante justice, just like the Old West, if we don't right the ship. And we're starting to see the mayors in our urban areas say, we can't continue down this road. The NAACP in Oakland issued a letter to the local officials demanding a state of emergency on crime. That's the first time that's happened in years. And the regional NAACP support them. And the governor of New York just sent 75 extra officers, California Highway Patrolmen, and it made a difference on arresting people and affecting crime. So we know what we need to do. We just need to set politics aside and do what we know will decrease crime because our minority communities, which are the very groups these people say they're trying to help, are the ones that are getting hurt the worst by these policies.
Well, if I may, I think that we're drawing a direct line from lack of cash bail to crime, and there are a whole lot of other factors involved in that. And I think where we got to look at how we got here. We got here because most of the time when we implement policy, it becomes ham-handed on the weak and the vulnerable, and it becomes very a light feather dusting on the rich and the powerful. If a senator blah blah blah's son does something where he deserves to be in jail or he deserves no cash bail, there's a way to work around it, and we see that. But what happens is we compensate with John Jones, who has not a tenth of the material resources. And I say this as someone who's worked in correction in Illinois, and I can say for a fact there, I can't speak for Texas, but I do know in Illinois, we've had people who languished in jail because they couldn't pay menial amounts of bail money. And that had to be addressed and had to be corrected. So I think we've got to understand, too, a lot of times when we say, well, if we do this, then crime goes up, we're not looking at the fact that we're not putting resources in. I've worked with a lot of people, and a lot of them will tell, yeah, are there career criminals? I'm not sitting here saying that they're not. But what I am sitting here saying is that if someone does something, whether, it's a mistake or he, knocks over a Walgreens because he didn't have resources or didn't see he could get resources any other way, a lot of times that shuts their lives down. They can't come out of jail of a 2 year or 18-month stretch and say, well, let me go to law school now, or let me go and do this, that, and the other. A lot of these people are pigeonholed in a lot of ways, and it literally pushes them to feeling that they only have certain, certain amounts of recourse now. So we've got to, if we're addressing the money's going to crime and what the system is unsustainable, the system has always been unsustainable because it's always favored certain groups at the direct expense of others. And I think that's something we also have to look at. If we're trying to look at a holistic approach, we can't just say, all right, well, deny deny those who've historically been denied the resources, deny them more as a punitive measure.
There's a lot there to unpack. And I would say, let me start by saying this. Look, we're always looking for ways to improve the criminal justice system. But, being as a person on the inside of the criminal justice system as an attorney, I don't do a lot of criminal law, but I do bail law. So I guess that's technically criminal law. But I think that on a comparison basis, our country has the fairest criminal justice system in the world. I mean, you forget there's countries where they can just hold you. I mean, it's like we're back before the Magna Carta. They accuse you of a crime and they can hold you. And if they decide to never have a trial, then they can just hold you. That we can't have that in this country, and we can't
Well,
have
there are people who've been held here in this, subjectively speaking.
True. But we have
everything that you're going to say. There's somebody, they're not just onesie twosies, but there's significant amounts of people who are falling through those same cracks.
With respect, I think part of the problem, because I'm not saying that our bail system or release mechanism by itself is committing more crime or causing crime. It is causing crime to increase, but we have a crime problem in our urban areas to begin with. I mean, you've got schools that have failed. You've got families that have failed. You have no economic opportunities in our urban cities. And we've had, riots where businesses were burned and then closed down and were never rebuilt. And so we are making it very difficult in our urban cities, and drugs are running amok. I mean, I talked to the sheriff of Tarrant County, one of the largest counties in Texas, and I said, what does the people in your jail all share? They share three things. One, no education, so they're dropouts. Number two, there's no father in their life. And number three, they have some outside influence, whether it's gang or drug or mental illness. And those are all things that we need to address. And I don't know how we address those things when we are setting up policies that encouraging some of those groups to commit more crime. And then I would say I think one of the problems that we have is we think that we can teach morality without teaching religion. And what we don't realize is if I'm telling you don't break the 10 Commandments, but I don't give you a reason why, then that's just my opinion. And you can look at me and say, Ken, you're an idiot. That's just your opinion. And if I think I do something, I need this for my living, then I think that's where we've lost our track, because a lot of what you're saying is true, that there's a justification for what was done. It still doesn't, in my mind, change the fact that it was a crime. It goes straight to punishment, though. There might not be a punishment. But what we're equivocating almost half of our crimes and saying, well, we need to do this holistic approach. That's what's getting us in trouble. The government is incapable of providing a holistic approach. I did a podcast with someone from DC talking about the First Step Act from Trump. And I was saying, look, we all want people who say they've changed to be released. We want people who will be productive citizens. But what we don't want is across the board release where we don't look to see if they've changed. And this was their response. The government's not good at doing individual assessments. They can't do, it's too expensive and they can't afford it. They can do across the board release. And so that's why the First Step Act that's what they did. And that's my criticism of trying to do a holistic approach. The government can't do that. They've never been able to. There's not one example, I think, where the government has successfully done that.
Respectfully, and this isn't just the two of us talking, and I don't want to take everyone else's time, but I'll say this last thing and I'll move on. I think respectfully that the government actually has done holistic relief because the government invented and created the middle class in America, whole cloth. What happens is before the 1940s, you only pretty much had rich people and poor people. Are you with me so far?
I understand
So
what
the
you're saying.
government, yeah, the government stepped in, and there was a lot of crime. You know what I'm saying? There were a lot of people who came to this country and they made their bones basically in a lot of criminal elements. And I'm trying to step around it. So they said, hey, we can't have these people coming over here and their whole lot in life, for the most part, is to create crime. So what happened is all of the things that you're saying, they effectively threw money at the problem. If you're saying that the schools are bad in certain neighborhoods, there's a reason schools are bad in certain neighborhoods because they're based off of, and I'll say in Illinois and a lot of other states, the school funding is based off of the property tax structure, which is inherently going to be unequal. If you're spending 30 cents on the dollar in the same urban areas you're talking about, you're spending $3 or $30 for children in the suburbs of Chicago or New Trier, you're effectively trying to kill a tree by picking off the leaves. You're not getting to the root of the problem. What I'm saying is the government has always known that strategically spending money in certain areas with certain demographics has alleviated a big portion of the problem. And we're going to pretend like they don't know that now when it comes to other groups. When we talk about, I'll make it quick. The difference between how we operated with the crack epidemic and how we're operating with the meth epidemic, and we're saying that on the inner cities, and they're wearing people out, you wear each other out in the heartland with methamphetamine. There in Ohio, there was a situation where they had run out of space in the morgue. Number one, no one's talking about that because that doesn't fit the common narrative, and it's I know you know that that's happening, but we haven't mentioned that, and there's a lot of crime associated with that as well. So what has happened is we realize that there has to be a different approach and a more compassionate approach, and we have to fund treatment and fund the programs are funded different, and the whole thing is attacked different when you look at one situation versus the other.
Hey guys, you know what? We're going to take a little break right here for a commercial, and we'll be right back on Diverse Talking Heads podcast. And we are back. This is Diverse Talking Heads podcast. And tonight we are talking with attorney Ken W. Good. And we're talking about the ongoing debate over zero bail policies and the increase in crime across the country. Yes, this is a hot topic, and we've talked about different aspects of it. Now we want to talk about what are some possible solutions. I know it's not going to be simple. I know it's not going to be something that you can elaborate on in a short period of time, but I'm going to ask you to try to throw something on the wall and let's see if that can stick. We know we're not going to solve this tonight, but we're going to move the conversation forward. So who has any ideas about how we can possibly make this whole debate go better?
Well,
This debate.
I have a suggestion. If we
Sure.
change the zero bail and give it to the discretion of the trial court, and if they're not successful on it, they don't get another one. And so we change from a charge-based release system to back to the discretion of the trial court. Now, I know we have criticisms about the trial court judges, but not using. But once you have a criminal history, the fact that they set bail, then you're not in jail because you're poor. You're in jail because you have a criminal history. And so I would say overlaying a level of accountability on any system that we use. But if we'd have to get rid of the charge-based release system to give the trial court judges discretion so that they can hold people accountable when they fail to show up.
Now, Ken, I will agree with that to a degree because I remember back in New York, you might have heard of this, the 3-strike system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, for you get caught with a firearm 3 times, that's it. You're going to do some time. Well, you talked earlier about the court systems being a revolving door. They come in, they get bailed out, they come back again. Let's put a limit on that, perhaps. If you come back 2 or 3 times, then that's it. 3 strikes. You're going to be here for a while. And because you have 3 strikes, we're going to bring all of those offenses up into one nice, neat package for you, and make it more severe than it is currently. That's my idea.
Well, I would modify that idea just a little bit. I would say you get a simple release the first time, which a simple release means you're going to count on yourself to come to court. You're going to remind yourself, you're going to keep up with it. If that's not successful, then you can't have a simple release anymore. So you'll get a private surety bond. You've got somebody who's monitoring you, who's calling you and telling you you've got court tomorrow. You've got someone reminding you, who's watching over you, who can report to the court if you're acting improperly. And if you fail to show up again, then it's very rare that you should get out after that.
Okay. Anybody else? Marcette? Oh, Kaushal, I'm sorry.
Something Ken said that surprised me earlier is that there's not enough jails, and because of that, uh, defendants have to be let go without paying bail, I believe you said, essentially making it no charge. So I'm wondering if you think that would be helpful, building more jails, which is a surprising thing to say because I thought jails were so lucrative that more jails were being built all the time.
No, they're very expensive to build. And, right, California could solve their issue by building additional jails, but they won't do it. They don't have the political will to do it. And so I think that they're kind of on the, but yes, that's what needs to be done. We have growing population and we have the certain percentage committing crime. And if you have a growing population with a certain percentage committing crime, you need more jail capacity over time. We keep hearing groups say, well, the United States has the most people in prison in the world. And I keep telling people, yes, and the world is sending all of their drugs to the United States. And so you would have to expect that we would have the largest amount of crime because 80% of crime arises from drugs. And so why wouldn't we have the most people in jail? We're not willing to stop the drugs from coming in. And now we're getting to the point where we're wanting to say, well, we shouldn't prosecute these people for drugs. Look at Portland, where we have, I think Marcette even mentioned, I don't know if it was Portland specifically, we're no longer prosecuting. We've taken away crimes for heavy drugs. And so we set up all these programs for people to get treatment, and less than 0.1% are electing to go to treatment. And we're having record numbers of overdoses every month. We're setting a new record. And because we've taken away the hammer, we can't force anybody to go to rehab. And so they won't go. And the government's just allowing us to lose a generation in Portland. And that's, I think, such a travesty.
Is the government putting more money into rehab, maybe pre-addiction counseling, post-addiction counseling, during addiction counseling?
They say they have, but nobody's electing to go. So that's one of the questions I have, is where all this money has gone, because they've set up these programs which less than 0.1% are electing to participate in. So where's the money gone?
Yeah, it's going somewhere. Amy.
Yeah, I wasn't going to make a comment, but you actually gave me the perfect segue. But this is very narrow. It is a very, very narrow solution. It is not broad at all, because it is a very specific type of offense. In the county that I live in Illinois, we have within the past year started embedding more social workers within police departments, and are finding a lot of success, particularly with a certain kind of domestic situation. It's not quite domestic violence, but it's a certain type of situation where you have a family member or loved one who is having a mental health crisis, and without the appropriate resources there to help deal with that crisis, the response was to arrest because you had an unruly person. So it is going tangential off of talking about drugs or talking about those kind of, because we define with our mental health board intellectual disabilities, substance abuse disorder, and general mental health crises. Those are all under the same umbrella. I'm not saying the same thing. They are under the same umbrella, the way our county defines it. Are finding a lot of success with reducing the initial arrest, which then you don't need bail. You don't need to let somebody go, because we solve the problem that was actually at hand, as opposed to treating it as if it was a criminal complaint. Again, that is very narrow, but I wanted to, since you gave me that opening, I wanted to mention it because it is an alternative that is working for that percentage of
Look,
situations.
if we could figure out a way to address mental health in arrests, I mean, we would all be living in Tahiti with the money we're making, because Harris County Jail is the largest mental health facility in the state of Texas. Mental health, and really, I'm critical of embedding mental health workers with police officers, because who's triaging the call? I mean, you're only going to be as good as the triage, because the highest number of deaths for, generally, when we're not talking about gangs, but when we're dealing with the criminal justice system, is family violence issues. It's family issues. When people go to the courthouse and shoot up the courthouse in Texas, it's family issues. There's one incident where 3 judges at a court of appeals was having an argument on a case, and they got shot. Somebody snuck in a gun and shot all 3 judges. It was a family appeal. And so that's why I'm concerned about embedding mental health workers or social workers in dealing with family violence calls. The county cannot afford, it doesn't have a deep enough pocket for having 3 people killed that are not criminal. They're not sheriffs. They're not deputies. They were just sent there to handle a call, and it wasn't triaged correctly.
Thank you. Charlie?
Well, I was going to mention off what Amy said. We're seeing that in the schools where I live in Illinois, where they want to, you have the school resource officer, which is usually a police officer. The trend is to move towards a social worker, mental health worker,
Oh, really?
something of that sort. That is beginning to occur, at least in the school district I'm in. So that was just adding up what Amy said on that.
Well, and Texas just, I think, passed a law requiring that every school have a police officer, not a social worker, but a police officer. So it's kind of going the opposite direction. I mean, what would the social worker do if we had a school shooter situation? That's that's what we're probably at risk for now. So what would the social worker do? I don't know. They're not equipped to do what's needed to be done.
Okay.
They would probably pull the alarm to have the police come and shelter in place with everyone else.
Absolutely.
Or hide.
Or be stupid like me and run towards them and, trying to be the brave hero that lasted 2 steps.
Karen?
I just want to chime in. One of our biggest problems with all the systems and stuff is the lack of staff.
Mm-hmm.
So for some reason, people decided that we don't need a certain amount of people to handle a caseload. My cousin is a probation officer, and her caseload is extensive. for one person. And she's got to make sure that they go to court, they do everything that they have to do. But I think that if we hire people who can, as you said, triage people to determine what their need is, we could probably lessen the severity of them returning back to court. Ronald Reagan said that people who were mentally ill years ago could do outpatient treatment. Some people can't do outpatient treatment. They need to be institutionalized. And because of that, that's one of the reasons why we have all of these people on the streets who are committing crimes repetitively. And until they kill somebody or maim somebody, then it doesn't become a story or an issue. You know, when it gets to that point, all the media wants to hang on to that piece that this person is a repeat offender. The courts didn't do anything. You only have so many people working in the court system. Can we increase staffing to a level that would help facilitate and minimize possibly everybody coming back? If you have somebody that's making sure that somebody comes to court and so forth and so on, probably. And if you take care of the mental health issue, like years ago, you had people who were addicts who went to clinics, got their methadone fix, and still went to work, and they were functioning people. But we've cut out so much stuff in America that streamlined the process of being repeat offenders, and you gave people the opportunity to change their dynamics in their life and not be a repeat offender, not be a person who is constantly incarcerated. What's the cost?
You know, the criticisms that we've had of the police for a couple of years has really had a decimating effect on people willing to be police. I mean, we've got Harris County just did a report in the last week, Houston. The Houston Police Officers Union, their city police chief, issued a report saying they have 230 something thousand cases that were closed with the notation lack of personnel over the last 8 years. So it looks like, if you didn't know that and you looked at the statistics for Houston, you would say crime is going down. Well, we have 230,000 cases that have not been investigated because they say they don't have enough personnel. I did an interview with a newspaper in Lubbock, and they were saying, well, how do we get rid of backlogs? And I said, well, you get rid of backlogs one of two ways. You either try more cases or you dismiss more cases. That's the only way you get rid of backlogs. And so I would recommend you try more cases, because right now, because of the pandemic, the state prison system's down 20% in its population because there haven't been cases. So people have been released and nobody's replaced them. And her response was, we have 7 openings in the DA's office. We would love to try more cases, but we don't have the personnel to try more cases. We have a criminal justice problem where people working in it don't feel like we as citizens have their back. And until we tell people, if you come and work for me, I'll have your back, then we're going to continue to have this problem. And then I would say, to your other point about, I think we're committing the same cycle that we did in the 60s. In the 60s, we felt more safe. And so we were more forgiving on our criminal laws. And then we started having crime go up. And then we started having a fight between our politicians over how to address it. And we didn't have an agreement. And so crime kept going up until we had a backlash. And the backlash was Ronald Reagan. We had the 3 strikes you're out type laws. And we had this tough on crime. We are repeating that right now. And our friends who are proposing all these things that are theories that have never been proved to work and are being shown every day not to work, don't realize that we're going down that same cycle, and we're going to have that same backlash that they could stop if they just put a level of accountability on what they're proposing. And because they're not, I predict we're going to have the same backlash with the same result. History will repeat itself when we don't learn the lessons.
Okay, thank you for that, Dan. And then Marcette, you get the last say.
Sure. I'm intrigued with the idea you mentioned of triage, and it sounds like it's needed at many different levels. I mean, my wife's a social worker and she doesn't want to be the first one on the scene. Although
Mhm.
she could probably help somebody if we knew it was not a
Yeah.
danger to her bodily. Okay. But she has the skills to help that particular piece. But she's not a police officer.
Mhm.
So part of that triage is finding a way to mix those teams, putting the right people in front who are trained properly, and training them together how to work together.
Yeah.
Obviously, resources, money, all the things we've talked about, we have to make that decision. Um, there are some disparities in justice. Obviously, it can never be a perfect system. As far as the bail goes, um, those who can afford it can always, you can't make it high enough. So, there is the other end where it's a difficulty. I know, Ken, you've given us one solution, which is to go back to what we were doing, which you feel very strongly works well. You have the expertise I don't in it. I was under the impression that the Safety Act in Illinois actually had discretionary part for the judges to say in a pretrial, and perhaps that's not happening in practice. So one of the things that I'm seeing here is an unwillingness at many levels to, after you try something, admit it's not working and
Mhm.
roll it back and fix it. So we get stuck in our politics on both sides of the spectrum of not wanting to admit we're wrong. And that all that ends up doing is swinging the pendulum too far either way.
I
Three
agree.
strikes and you're out. Had problems where, somebody stole 3 loaves of bread and got a life sentence, and somebody else killed somebody and got off. So, you know,
We are seeing lots of examples of rollbacks, though. We just don't hear about them in the news. New York passed bail reform. They've rolled it back 3 or 4 times now. Alaska tried bail reform. They rolled it back. Uh, California tried it and they had a referendum and the voters voted it down. So you have a lot of reforms that have been rolled back. And so, I mean, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, the biggest problem we have, I mean, let me give you this example. So in Houston, what Houston's doing on misdemeanors is seen as a complete failure by the state legislature, and they see it's driving policy in Texas to the opposite side. So what do the people who advocated for Houston do? They go to Ohio and they argue to the legislature that Houston is the gold standard and they should implement that statewide. And so people have to then come to us to ask us, well, what the truth is. And we have to give them the data and the stats so they can go back to Oklahoma and argue. And then the groups that are, filing all these cases that they keep losing at the Court of Appeals. I did a podcast with them and they're arguing, well, every trial court that's ruled on these issues ruled in our favor. Yeah, but every Court of Appeals has reversed it. And so you still are making the same arguments even after they've been reversed. After the Supreme Court has denied cert, you are batting 0 for 5 at the United States Supreme Court, but you're still making the same argument that's been rejected by the 11th Circuit and the 5th Circuit multiple times. And the last case said your case should have never been filed in federal court, and you're still arguing it's the gold standard and that the Constitution requires X when those courts say the opposite. And that's where we're having a problem. We can't even agree on facts. That's an example where we just can't even agree on simple facts.
Okay, Marset?
I think that the big problem is that we keep approaching this as a zero-sum game. I've worked in a variety of capacities. I've worked in mental health. I've worked in drugs. I've also worked in the school system. Where in inner city Chicago, one of the roughest schools in Chicago at that time, it's turned around now. But we have sort of, and to say can't have a school resource officer with. Can you hear me?
No, we're losing you.
School resource officer. Okay.
You're in and
Okay.
out.
What I was saying is that I don't think that we have to continue to look at the problem as a zero-sum game. If you have a tactical social worker, you can't have a school resource officer or vice versa. I think you can do both, But the problem becomes the next question is going to how are we going to afford it? How are we going to fund having both of these people at all schools? And I think that's the part that we need to work out, because I do think that both need to be there for the benefit of our kids. And when we talk about school shooters and school shooting, a lot of the times, pretty much most of the school shooters, as well as the mass shooters that we're looking at in the last 20 years, have been people who have somehow slipped through the cracks of the criminal justice system, should not have been able to have weapons. And for a variety of reasons, that would be a whole other show, they still had weapons. So I think that there's a situation where we can look at more than just one A to B type situation. Like I said, I'm not sitting here saying, hey, well, bring flowers to a gunfight, figuratively. I am saying that, yeah, there are situations where you need school resource officers, and there are situations where you also need, in the same environment, a social worker or someone that the person who is acting out has built up a trust with, or someone who can professionally de-escalate them so that there does not have to be a shooting and no one has to lose their life.
Let me state my position on this. We're trying to make every situation everything for people. We're trying to make a school fix everything for people. We're trying to fix social service fix everything for people. And now we're trying to do the same thing with the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system was not made to do that. It was made to, you get arrested, you're accused of a crime, you exert the lowest amount of pressure that you can to that person for them to turn into a productive citizen, and then you get them back into society and they become productive. If they get arrested again, then more pressure, and then again more pressure, and ultimately they're a career criminal. Now we're turning it into situations where we have to say, well, what else? There's something else going on. We need to find out what they need, where they are. And that's not what the criminal justice system was intended to do. The criminal justice system was intended to find out whether you committed a crime and exert what pressure we need to get you to be a productive citizen. And I'm concerned that we're trying to turn the criminal justice system in what you're talking about into something that was never intended to do and cannot do. If we turn it into that, we get what we're getting now in some of our urban areas. We're getting chaos, which creates de facto decriminalization, which creates more crime. And that's the opposite of what you're even seeking. And if it's not working, we need to recognize it and go back to what works.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, for that final word. In conclusion, there are several alternatives to bail bonds, and each of them offer different opportunities, pros, cons, personal recognizance, pretrial release programs, home confinement, cash bail. They're all options that can be considered in seeking release while you are in jail and you await trial. We know some of them work better than others. I personally believe that some of them have been started to keep certain people down. We know that they do cause a lot of problems, not only in the culture, but in the families. But some kind of reform is definitely needed. So tonight, I would like to thank all of our moderators. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Kolschel. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Marcette, for being here and moderating. And I want to thank our special guest, attorney Ken W. Good. Ken, thank you for being here as well. I'm your host, Calvin Gibbs, and it's always imparting that we take 2 steps to the rear and get on out of here. Until the next episode of Diverse Talking Heads podcast, exit stage left.